Yeah. Well, thanks very much. This is absolutely wonderful. I don't know if there's anything else going on in Westminster at the moment, but given that there may be, I'm extremely grateful to you all for coming and joining in this conversation. And actually, I think it's very relevant for the election. I'm not going to be announcing any great policies from the Conservative Party on our manifesto, but I think it is something that intellectually all parties need to be talking about, which is the role of the regulators and how we regulate our economy, how we create legislation, how Parliament interacts with the government and how the government interacts with industry. And I think an important acceptance that we have over the last, I think, 30 years created an enormous regulatory environment that has put huge burdens on business and I think has detracted from economic growth and increasing productivity. And so I think that if I look at the work that we've done in the white paper, and actually, by the way, congratulations on this excellent document, The Future of Regulation, beautifully written. Many of the points you've raised here we've actually executed on. I'm very happy to be challenged in any of the areas that you've got here that we haven't, and I'll give you a logical reason why we haven't done it, but it's all open for debate. I had 3 pillars to my work. The first was to try and reduce the current stock of regulation on the statute books, and that follows on from the rule bill and the work around leaving the European Union and Brexit, but also a fundamental review of all the different sort of regulatory burdens and principles that are sitting in our law book, and what could we try and adapt, rescind, or evolve. The second part was how to control the flow of regulation going forward. So one of the areas I think we've had a lot of quite right pressure on is how do you actually assess the cost of regulation? And if you can assess the cost of regulation more effectively, then you'll be able to have a more grown-up and mature discussion about whether it's worth it. And we're clearly aware of a huge quantity of legislation that's come onto the books without an effective impact assessment. And in fact, I freely admit this as a minister. The impact assessment is frankly a last thought. It often happens at the end, and it's perfectly acceptable to challenge the premise in the impact assessment. Often comes at it from one single angle, and there isn't a mechanism really to challenge that. So the white paper is very clear on encouraging the Regulatory Policy Committee, which is it's not actually a policy committee, it's a group of individuals who assess and monitor the regulatory flow, to have more teeth, to go back to departments and say, have you really costed this effectively? And then to look at the reviews 10 years later to see whether what's actually happened. So was the impact assessment correct? Is this regulation working? And introducing sort of new concepts such as sunset clauses, trying to get the PBL, which is the Parliamentary Business and Liaison Committee, which sits as a junction box for legislation, to just make sure that ministers have really looked at alternatives to regulations. And the issue I've found, and I saw this as a government minister for the last 2 years, is that a huge amount of regulation comes onto the books. It's very specific, so it's very unadaptable. And that causes then concomitant problems, particularly if it's related to technology, which obviously is moving faster than legislation ever can. But there's often a gut reaction, something needs to be done, whatever it may be. It could be building safety, it could be, football regulations, or whatever. And so we need to find ways to, first, yes, really assess the economic impact of those activities, and second, to look at alternatives and try to just think more sort of flexibly minded about what are we trying to achieve and how do we get there. And then the third task, which is really the main topic of this white paper, which is about smarter regulation. So getting regulators to regulate for innovation, investment and growth, and injecting into them a service culture. So you see regulation as a service and as an enabler. And I think too often we look at regulation as a block. Regulators are there to prevent things from happening or to fine companies, which clearly isn't very helpful for society. So we've adapted 10 principles of smarter regulation. They're all very straightforward. So you've got to collaborate, you've got to be transparent, look at international norms, timeliness of response, and other innovation, and how do you promote innovation. And I think this will be quite important because it will give businesses now leverage against the regulators to say, you're, in your decision-making frameworks and processes, you're not considering economic growth. You're doing too much for yourself in terms of your own needs rather than thinking about the universe that you manage and oversee. I think it'll give consumers greater opportunities as well to drive regulators to think about innovation and, again, make sure in their framework they have the growth mandate. And actually it'll give regulators the excuse they probably didn't have. If any of you here have dealt with regulators, you'll know that often they say, well, I'm sorry, my hands are tied. That's not our mandate. Our mandate is only to prevent, accidents in manufacture of sweets or something. Whereas now they have the opportunity to say, okay, well, we can now be an enabler. And if you look at what a good regulator does, regulators actually like the Food Standards Agency, And to some extent now the Health and Safety Executive and so on, they're really going out there, or Ofgem, they're really going out there and working with industry to solve the problems. If it's grid connectivity and the capacity we need, if it's how to make sure that businesses aren't encumbered with significant amounts of regulatory burdens. And they should be responsible for growing the business sector that they cover. I think that's a really important principle. And thinking always about what is it that the businesses need, ultimately the consumer and the market. So hopefully we've injected, like the adrenaline in Pulp Fiction, into the heart of the regulators, a new sort of set of important principles around the growth duty, which, whatever happens at the next election, will be really important for any government who wants to grow the economy and create economic growth through innovation and investment.
Thank you very much. And I should say at the start, we're here to celebrate and discuss the three separate papers. There's our paper on the future of regulation from a few weeks ago.
That's very good, yes.
The government's new...
This is even better.
This
is even better and a better read. A more interesting front cover, if it's possible.
One of them was written and edited by me, and one of them wasn't, so,
What's the third one? I didn't know there was a third one.
So the third one, and this is where we all owe you an apology, as of today, we've published a new paper called Regulating for Growth, which is about how you regulate...
Where's that?
It's not yet.
It's not yet.
It's online.
You've jumped me on this, but I like the idea. I like the title already.
Well, so, the reason I'm apologising to everyone is that the last time Matthew, the author, published a paper, Suella Braverman was fired and Westminster descended into chaos. And this week he decided to one-up himself. I'm not quite sure where you go on your next paper, Matthew, but I'm thinking sort of floods, asteroid strikes.
Yes.
So Charlotte, you've been involved in all sides of this. You were you worked in the private sector for the stock markets. You both in the UK and elsewhere. You helped with the Khalifa review. You've been working on open banking and CPS. So you've seen the private. You've been regulated, and you've been, well, if not a regulator, then a government.
Definitely not a regulator.
No, but someone on the. I mean, what does that does what Lord Johnson was saying chime with you?
Yeah, and I think the thing that charms the most is the fact that until you're close to it, you don't realise just how many regulators are involved in any one sector, particularly in financial services, which I've been in for my whole career. And the challenge we all have is that those aren't always joined up. So you go and talk to a bank and they'll be telling you just before Christmas that something's come in from the PRA, but then the FCA needs something else in and their team is about to go on holiday. So what we need actually is a sort of joined up approach to it as well. It's been interesting sort of moving over to the fintech sector. So anyway, any reform bankers coming into fintechs, it sounds cool. And in fintech, it's new technologies in all the time, and you're pushing the boundaries. And having done quite a couple of startups in capital markets, I used to have an appointed person at the FCA. I could call them up. I could say, right, I'm thinking about devising this. This is how we think it believes in the rules. We're likely to put an application in along these lines, and you would have a very good two-way conversation. But that's all gone now. We've moved much more from a principles-based process to a rules-based, but with multiple different participants involved. And that makes it very challenging when you're in fintech, because you just want to be able to read the rules and say, well, can I apply or not? And it's not clear, because of course a lot of them haven't even been written yet, because you're sort of writing them as you down the road as you're going along. So I think that's the challenge when we look at these new sectors, innovation, tech, even life sciences, is how do you engage really effectively with the regulator and many times with officials if the regulator hasn't prioritised it yet, so that you can effectively inform some of that regulation at the same time as you're pushing the boundaries on it. And I think that's the big challenge we've got.
So I mean, one of the distinctions that Matthew's paper draws is between technologies that were born free and born captive. So yes. Fintech would be a good example of that, or crypto, say. You are doing something that no one has done before, and there aren't any rules about, versus something like drones, where there are lots and lots of rules about what can you fly stuff through the air and what you need to do that. But they were invented for a very different world. And the pattern seems to be clear that the technologies which were born free tend to flourish better, especially when the regulators kind of leave them alone for a bit and then come in and say, okay, now we're going to do proportional regulation, we're going to kind of sand off the edges. Whereas the ones which are born in that world where rules already apply and you have to shift the existing rules and get different, if we've had this conversation before, if you are using a drone to fertilise your crops, is that a responsibility for for DEFRA? Is it responsibility for the Civil Aviation Authority? There are just it just not because any individual is attempting to block it or being willfully obstructive, but just the very nature of different bits of government trying to talk to each other. It just takes longer to happen. Would you say that's a fair reflection?
I think it is. I think crypto is a good example of something where we've said we want to be a crypto hub across the world. But actually the crypto firms are turning up, going to the regulator, and especially the American ones who aren't very used to having an open dialogue with the regulator, and saying, can you show me the rule book? And the regulators say, well, we don't really know. What sort of rules are you thinking about, and what's your submission? So you have got the regulators getting frustrated with industry for not putting the submission in, and industry waiting for regulatory guidelines. So I think that is the challenge, and I think we've got to get much better at closing that gap between regulators and industry to actually have a more informed discussion.
I mean, I think, so we've made good progress with sort of the so-called sandboxes, but the reality is how we look at things, and this is what makes Britain a great country, the principle between the common law and the sort of law of code. And we've drifted through our many years in the European Union, and I wasn't, by the way, a Brexiteer or anything, so I haven't got an axe to grind here, but we've drifted into codified law rather than common law. I mean, if you look at the laws, there are plenty of laws there. If you look at food safety, you can't poison people. Just because you have a new type of novel food doesn't allow you to poison people. The obligations on producers are still exactly there. You can't pollute the environment, you can't treat your staff badly, you can't rip off your investors. All the laws are there. And I think we'd be far better having a more permissive concept around regulation. Because as soon as you limit through code, as soon as a civil servant sits down and tries to write the rules around something, effectively you're immediately limiting its ability to perform to the highest possible level. And that's a big philosophical point, which I think has got to be embedded in this principle.
But, novel foods is a great example. At the moment, effectively, you have to ask the government's permission to innovate.
You do. And no one quite knows in government who is to give you the permission, exactly as you say. So think what we're losing. These companies are now going to Canada and other countries. And also we're losing the opportunity to have protein created for us, which is far more environmentally friendly and in many respects possibly better, but also possibly not. So, it's not a completely straight line.
And we can't ignore the elephant in the room. There has been an election.
There's an elephant in the room.
you are your ministerial tenure may continue for another 5 years, may end in
5 weeks. 5 weeks or 5 years.
Yeah.
It's quite binary.
How much what's your sense of where Labour is on these issues? Have they? Because we published this paper on the future of regulation, and Polly Toynbee wrote an entire thing about in the Guardian about how these disgraceful Tories haven't noticed that the world has changed. There's nothing in here about all of our sewage polluted rivers. It's like, well, no, Polly, because it's an analysis of central government. And she said, and these regulation averse Tories, they seem to want more regulation. They want an impact statement for every regulation. Yeah. I was like, yeah, Polly, they already exist. The entire paper is an analysis of the regulation impact statements that already exist. But it feels that there is philosophically quite a lot of the things that you've been talking about, quite a lot of the things the white paper has, is not stuff that Labour historically agrees with
I think, and again, I'm careful, I'm sensitive of the timing of this discussion, but I think conservatives inherently believe that business people and the markets
some conservatives,
hopefully most, drive better outcomes. That's not to say you need regulation. This is an important principle. You need good regulation to allow markets to function properly, to have trust in markets. If you take food safety or restaurant standards, we're not in a position, or how aircraft are maintained, we're not in a position as individuals to make market decisions on that. You have to have regulators around that. And for financial services, it's very important. And you need legal structures. But it's about how you do the regulation and using markets more effectively to drive good incentives. And ultimately, you need to free businesses and people to be as creative as they possibly can. I think that's at the core of it. My concern with Labour is fundamentally, and I think we're going to see this play out over the next few years, if they win an election, they're far more big state, and they tend to like restrictions and regulations and limitations, because I think it makes them feel safer, and I think that's what the public wants, so they end up responding to that. It's much harder not to do that.
They won't have any money to spend, so regulating is the only thing you can do.
Yes, but the best thing actually you can do is to get a better regulatory framework if you haven't got much money to spend. And in a way, it should force a level of creativity on government that is all often too lacking. So my concern is you're going to see a continued layering of regulation on our activities, and life will be made more difficult for people, businesses and citizens, and the economy to flourish. And I think that's very depressing and disappointing. We'll see how it plays out, but that's an enormous difference between the Conservatives and Labour, and it's not about less regulation. I have people come up to me. It's quite bizarre. You would have thought regulation is quite rational and a bit dry, but people get very emotional about it, and they come up into my face and they say, we want more regulation, what are you doing? And other people shake me furtively by the hand and say, well done, keep up the good work. It's not about more or less. The idea that it's about more or less is absurd. More regulation doesn't lead to cleaner rivers. Better regulation and higher degrees of investment and better management of water companies leads to better and cleaner rivers and cheaper water supplies. So it's about how you do it, and you have to take a step back and actually think about what you've tried to do originally in terms of setting the regulatory framework and how the regulators themselves interact with the markets, and they have to be more pro-innovation, and ultimately they have to let go. And I find that I think for some of these price reviews now, they're filling in 10,000 pages of data, whereas 20 years ago they filled in 300 pages. Now the cost just in that one act is hugely draining on the economy, and it hasn't clearly led to cleaner glasses of water or cheaper services.
I mean, there's a statistic we cite in here, which is just me on Google, but judging by the staff numbers in their annual reports, the number of financial services people employed by financial services regulators has quadrupled since 2010. And the size of the financial services industry is exactly the same. But I mean, Charlotte, in terms of labour and impact, I mean, is there a sense that the businesses you've spoken to are worried? I mean, things like the workplace regulations, for example, the increased rights for unions and all of that. That's something which is very, very popular with voters, but is sending a shiver down the spines of quite a few business leaders I've spoken to.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's the fear of the unknown as much as anything, isn't it? So I think what does business want, particularly, as I said, if I think of financial services, is they want clarity and they want to know where we're going to be and the direction of travel. I think there has been a huge amount of feeding into the financial services manifesto from prominent businesses in the city, so I don't think anyone's expecting any surprises if we look at the manifesto.
But we've also got like 200 reviews and consultations underway, which I mean, who knows what's going to happen to them?
I know. Well, I'm chairing a task force which was due to report in 3 weeks, so trust me, I'm trying to work out where that's going. But I think we, as industry, we all must sit there and show actually what does industry want, and I think over time we have become a little bit reticent in doing that and speaking up a bit more, because businesses are quite afraid of regulators. And compared to the US, where there was some sort of regulation, you would just see legal action taken.
Yeah.
Here, it just doesn't happen. So actually, it's now as industry's chance to coalesce behind what's really important. Where are they? But a lot of the time, we just don't see that in Europe as much as you do in the US. And I think it's industry's time to say, look, step up and actually say what is important, and what is important to a consumer, what is important to an SME and the business you're trying to serve them with. And let's make sure we have continuity. What we don't want is to have 12 months of everyone getting up to speed and then nothing happening, because that's just a disaster for industry in whichever business you're in.
I like that point. I think it's an extremely bad place we've got to, where businesses are so-called frightened of the regulator. And I have businesses that come to me and have very legitimate points raised about the slowness of responsiveness, for example, with a certain permission or permitting. And they're frightened that I use their name if I confront the regulator in case there'll be some repercussion. That's not the country we live in. And in fact, we should hold the regulators to task. And I think that they have in many instances not performed their duties at all well. And I think it's absolutely essential that businesses confront this, and that we as a body politic and a society are actually as tough on regulators as we expect regulators to be on businesses who underperform or break the law. That's a really important culture that I want to try and drive forward, which is this sense that businesses are there to be served by the regulator, and the regulator should look upon every act that they do. When they wake up in the morning, they should say, how have I served the businesses who I regulate? How have I served the consumers? Not how have I necessarily fulfilled my own specific functions in order to check a box and not get overly scrutinised by a parliamentary committee.
But there's a sense here that politicians have sort of made a rod for their own backs. So the quangos and the regulatory model we have is created in the 1980s by the Thatcherites as a way to inject private sector expertise into government. And then now you have a situation where politicians have outsourced huge amounts of responsibility to those quangos. Ofcom now theoretically has it has to sort of decide what safe speech is on the internet and what you're allowed to say or not. With your PRA, FCA, there are, and you're sort of left with ministers sort of sitting there quite powerlessly in the centre, sort of urging regulators to, hey, remember growth, or it doesn't feel like this model works as well as it.
Well, the white paper is very specific on ministers' responsibilities. And actually, ministers have a great degree of responsibility. And I'm interested that the culture has already changed. Kemi Badenoch has been leading this charge, by the way. And when I first became minister only 2 years ago, I was told I couldn't talk to this regulator. I mustn't talk to the CMA. It's not my job. They're independent. The fact is they're independent. And you want, as businesses, independent decision-making. You don't want the decisions to be taken by politicians. But they're not isolated. And actually, we have to look at regulators as you would a body. And I think they look at themselves as independent organs. You know, your heart, your lungs, you know, your kidneys and stuff, they all operate as one holistic function. And actually making them think about how they operate together is as important as how the head has to drive that. So, you know, I'm very much expecting that after the next election, the government, hopefully a Conservative one, will be very, very robust in making sure that they drive the direction of the regulators and also give them cover to take more risk. And this is something that we haven't touched on. And it's crucial in the financial services sector where I say we in the body politic for the last 25 years, really derogated our financial services ability to perform by trying to remove risk to zero and selling to the public that risk can be reduced to zero. And by doing that, you've done two things. You've destroyed returns and you've reduced capital going into the economy. And that's an enormous problem because the biggest risk in the world actually is not that one company might go bust, which it has to, frankly, if the system is to function, but that we're not going to have the money in order to pay for our personal retirements or the capital in order to invest in innovation. Then we fall behind in the technology race and we're just a second-class price-taking nation. So the seriousness of this is far greater, I think, than people realise. It's not just, you know, how do we tweak the food safety standards to sort of make it a bit more responsive to permitting. It is an intrinsic cultural change that we as a nation have to embrace. That means we have to embrace managed risk, we have to embrace an element of poor outcomes, and we have to allow also consumers the right to make true decisions, both good and bad.
Yes, I mean we pointed out before you get more warnings about putting £100 in a tracker fund of your savings than you do if you want to bet it on the 315 at Chepstow.
Yes, yes.
And you don't get any warnings for leaving that £100 in your bank account, not earning any interest.
You don't. That's a very good point.
Losing value.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Year.
That's a very. They don't say that because now I'm going to be sent an email from my bank saying, "Have I realised if I leave it in my interest-only account or whatever?" This is the point. And we, you know, as in financial services, and we sent all our clients documents twice as thick as that. And all that did was cover us. It didn't give the consumer, in my view, any protection. You know, what drove the quality of the service was a culture in my business and all our businesses that we wanted to serve the customer, and ultimately they could sue us if we failed to do that. It wasn't really the regulatory framework, and I think that we have been too soft on ourselves and the regulators in allowing them to pile more regulations on companies in order to respond to their own needs, rather than responding to the priority, which is economic growth and the duties they have in order to make sure that the market is safe and the consumer is protected.
Charlotte, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that we've got to this point where regulators have, things get really, really critical, and then suddenly the regulators pay attention to them. So consumer duty, whether one likes it or not, which is supposed to be phoning you up about your £100, is there in theory designed to protect the consumer. But actually, is it really working in practice? We can argue whether that's really the right thing or not, and it only covers certain parts of it. So I feel we sort of lost track of where we're going to rather than where we are just in front of us. Yeah. And if you go and speak to regulators and say, okay, how are you envisaging what's going to happen in 2 years' time? You just don't have these teams. There's no magic team that takes open letters and say we must work on this. They tend to work on things right in front of them or over the next 6 months. So we also have to have this vision of where are we also trying to get to, especially on the international stage. I think it's really important. If you look at capital markets and listings, big debate at the moment, is it the rules that need to change? Is it the pension fund rules need to change? Or do we just need to reinvent the way we list and trade stocks? Who knows? But we've got to have that dialogue, because at the moment we're sitting there saying, let's change the rules and see if that works. Or that's not working, let's make the pension funds invest. Or that's not working either, let's go and do something about it.
No, I'm going to push back against that. I think, again, if you don't mind me saying so, you're quite traditional in your discussion, because you're talking about the rules. And the point is we should release the rules and allow people to operate on principles-based systems where they make those decisions and where they're judged on the outcomes and whether or not they've made sensible decisions. That's at the core.
But at the moment, the big banks will say under the consumer duty, if someone falls in love with someone over the internet and agrees to wire them £10,000 so that they can come and meet them, and the bank says, no, this is not a verified bank account. Like we are very, very suspicious of this. Please don't do this. And the person says, no, I'm going to send the money anyway. That the bank is then expected to pay the person back when it inevitably turns out that beautiful Ileana from Sweden was in fact, Boris from Novgorod.
Disappointing, certainly. But I think that ends up. I mean, the issue with these regulations again is they're very well intentioned. The government wants to make sure people are protected in online scams and frauds are now the greatest degree of crime by a country mile, and really affect everyone. I thought everyone in this audience, including myself, has been not in that specific. Catfish scam.
She was called Tatiana.
But have just been defrauded. And I think that's something that we need to be very aware of, because the issue there is, a great firm in the United Kingdom doing a good job has a great strong culture, but of course these people who are perpetrating these crimes are often abroad and so on. And I think it's right that there's a sense of responsibility of businesses in terms of what happens next. So it's not okay just to say, okay, well, you've bought this knife, shotgun, I don't really care what you do with it. It's not my problem. But at the same time, people, by derogating people's individual responsibilities and liabilities, you're actually derogating the person themselves. That's very unconservative. It's very against natural liberty of people, and it's extremely damaging to the economy if you take it to the nth degree. And we have to be aware. This is why I said at the beginning about the point of understanding what regulation does. So if you take the money laundering regulations around bank accounts, it's right that you should say to the bank, you shouldn't facilitate money laundering. I mean, I think we would agree that's probably quite a sensible, good thing to do. But you get to the stage where it just, for them, the risk is so high of a single failure that it's much better just to say, okay, that side of the audience, I'm just not going to deal with you because you will have a bit of risk, and I can't take any risk. And I think that's an issue of the regulators, because the regulators need to then try and reapply proportionality back to these organisations and go back to what we did have probably about 20 years ago, where you had responsibility. You had to show that you'd taken a sensible decision, but there was an understanding element of risk there, that there may be one account out of 100,000 that may slip through, but better that than shut off 20,000 accounts in order to make sure that it's cast iron.
Or say that any apolitically exposed person such as Lord Johnson, it's just going to be too much trouble to run a bank account for you because we have to do so many extra checks. So thank you very much.
Well, that's an issue, and that's not the purpose of the legislation either. This is why you have to match up the legislation more effectively with what you want the outcome to be, and give more flexibility to the regulators actually to interpret it properly and issue sensible guidelines. But we're limiting ourselves, and I think it's a real issue. If I look at productivity decline over the last 30 years, I think a lot of it can be traced back to our desire to regulate everything in a codified sense. And if we can break free of that and look back at the common law principles and the principles of risk and sensible decision-making within principle frameworks, which actually is how a lot of this legislation started, like health and safety. It wasn't a box-checking exercise. If we can go back to that, we will actually revolutionise our country again. And countries that do that tend to flourish far more successfully than countries that don't.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we've got a surprisingly large and surprisingly high-quality audience.
Yes, surprisingly high quality, certainly.
Given not surprising for the CPS generally, but given the news at the moment. So, and I think quite a lot of people will want to ask questions. So, if Jensen can speak into the microphone. So we have the lady next to you, and then just
very briefly, I'm up from Somerset, very country. As a former lawyer, I'm very interested in this distinction between the codified laws and common law, which gives you the flexibility. And I think it costs you an arm and a leg, but talk will cover a lot of situations where we still got to sell the idea and sell the difference, because the majority of people, even people who regard themselves as educated Remainers, couldn't take the point.
Well,
I'm asking for a sales spiel.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that the concept of self-certification is very important. Sort of going back to that again. So it's not exactly the same thing. I mean, you've got to have go back to the common law principles, which are enormously powerful, but also the principles of permissiveness, allowing you to do everything you like so long as it's within the common law boundaries. And then self-certification, we've become obsessed about inspectors going around and stamping things. And I mean, and the economic cost is gargantuan. I think we should be pretty fearful about this. There are two good examples, if I could just briefly list them, because I think they're quite interesting. One of which is, if you're a news agent and you sell, Ginsters, pasties and Coke and Twixes and stuff, you have to have an annual inspection from the Health and Safety Authority from your local council. And that's frankly ridiculous nowadays. All you're operating is a fridge. You're not running a supermarket. And so we've been trying to change that, but actually that's in legislation. It's a very good example of codified legislation. It has unintended consequences. So we have to go back and try and shift that. And then the other example I give, and I'm going through this personally, so I have a conflict of interest, is bats. And if anyone, hands up here if anyone's had an issue with a bat. Normally when I go to an audience, a forest of hands goes up. And you have this bizarre situation where, rightly, we want to protect our environment. So this is the principle of good intentions at the beginning and important ones. But you can't do a bat survey except in May and June when they're mating. And you have to film them. You literally have to film them at it. It's sort of like some sort of bat erotica, which is a bit bizarre, and it's very expensive. And of course, that's delayed me. So I buy a house in the middle of last year. I'm stuck for nearly 10 months until this last week when I was able to do the bat survey. It cost many thousands of pounds. Then I have to have a report, and then it has to go to various different agencies. The whole thing takes probably another 6 months and costs more money. And then at the end of it, the amelioration actually is very straightforward. it's a bat box or some type of little hole in the roof. Now, that cost me a few £100. But the process around that cost me probably £10,000 and takes a year, and that's separate to the cost of the state. And think of the economic cost of the delay of that. And this is being replicated 100,000 times or more across the country at any one time. It's gargantuan.
If anyone's children are looking for the most secure profession, can I recommend biodiversity net gain officer?
No, but I hope not, because I hope that we're going to change these things so that you can apply practically. So you want to say you could apply the amelioration at the beginning of the process, thus encouraging bat boxes and nesting and so on, and reducing the extraordinary cost in our economy. And I tell that story because it just embeds in people's minds. But economically, it's a disaster for us. And we shouldn't think it's okay and shrug our shoulders. And there's been too much of that. And I think we have to be sort of pretty forceful about saying, let's look at what the outcome we want. How do we get straight there? And cut out this extraordinary processing, and how do we give more people more trust to do those things themselves?
Charlotte, you seem to be nodding away in that.
Yeah, I'm just laughing about the bats because I just know how many people have used that time before May to try to get rid of the bats before the survey comes
Well, I
in.
haven't.
So,
I can just assure you that now.
I have a house in Fulham, there's not many bats.
A law-abiding. But the problem is also then people. The problem is when you have excessive regulation that doesn't meet common sense standards, people. Just cheat the system, and that's even more unfair and wrong.
I mean, there was a great example for me. A developer was telling us that the locals who were resisting development on a disused airfield claimed to have found a colony of rare mice, and which there would be no evidence of these mice over the last 20 years. And the developer pointed out the site was actually the home of a very, very large population of feral cats.
Well, we've got to protect our environment. But again, and the Conservatives actually we've started to change these things, and we've built in these pilots about having builders who will have BAT certification and so on. These are really important things to do, and we have to drive that agenda forward. That's why it's relevant.
That comes back to principles-based regulation.
It totally does.
It's sitting there saying, actually, what are the principles we're trying to get to? Versus the rules, because if you put rules in, generally people will try to find a way around it. It doesn't matter what sector you're in.
Phil.
Phil Aldrich at Bloomberg. I was at an event with Jonathan Hill, was talking about similar subjects actually. Regulating risk to zero means you regulate returns to zero as well. But he was, rather than blaming the regulators, he was blaming the politicians. He was saying that basically you guys set the objectives, and if there is a failure, you're the first out of the box to criticise.
Absolutely.
And so I mean, for example, Thames Water or the whole water industry, the regulator Ofwat was being given the objective of keeping bills as low as possible. Yep. Inevitably, the investment is much lower than what was needed. But it always feels quite a bit easy and a bit unfair for the politicians to stand up and just say the regulators are making the wrong decisions. There has to be tolerance of error and tolerance of failure at the political level, and support for regulators to be able to do this. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that, and then just separately, do you know why Rishi Sunak called the election July the 4th?
I'll answer your first question first. This is my point. I made it very clear at the beginning. You've got to look at the two key pillars. If you take out reducing the current stock of regulation as one of my roles, if you look at how you change regulatory outputs from Parliament and how oversight is taken by ministers in Parliament, it's absolutely right that we need to give the political cover to regulators to run principles-based regulation and to have managed risk, and then how we give them the frameworks. What's important now is that we've got this growth mandate firmly injected into the hearts of all the regulators. Financial regulators aren't under my purview, but they have a similar principle now, which will allow them to make those decisions that will look at things in the bigger picture. And you're completely right about pricing. I mean, it was the right thing to do to focus on the price to the consumer at the beginning of the sort of privatisation concept for the monopoly utilities. But clearly, over the last few years, we know now the investment requirements are just so significant. And that's a lot because things have changed. Someone said, oh, well, whose fault was that? Well, actually, we didn't realise we were going to need so much electricity, even 5 years ago. I mean, I've helped bring in a very significant data centre in the northeast of England, and they said, oh, we're going to need a lot of power. You sort of think, well, a lot of power, what is that? Well, half the power of London is going to be required for this one building. So this is we're looking at a completely different premise for things like that. So you've got to bear in mind that this new investment case is truly something that's come upon us, and now we've got to react to it. And I think there's a consensus amongst all of us in the room, and all of us across the country, that we want to have these utilities that can balance consumer price and quality of service with the need for investment. And that's the future. And we're very aware of that in the Conservatives, and I think it's absolutely vital. That's why my paper is titled Regulation for Innovation, Investment and Growth. Those, the first two are the precursor for the second. And in terms of why did he call the election, I don't know. That wasn't in my regulatory white paper, so I can't answer that. I think what's important though is we know we're going to have an election at some point in this period. I think it's a brave and powerful thing to say, okay, let's have the election, let's make that decision. And I think that what's frustrated me as investment minister, going around the world, which is my other role, is just how phenomenal the UK is, how amazing our economy is, how amazing our culture and people are, and our brain power. And when I go abroad, everyone says the UK is amazing. It's my premier destination for investment. And it is. The facts are there. We're the top investment destination basically in the whole world for nearly every sector that matters. And if we're not number one, we're number two to a country like the USA in dollar terms. This is amazing. And I think people watching this or listening now or thinking about the election don't really realise the importance of good economic management on the whole, which the Conservatives have provided, and our framework for always trying to have the lowest possible taxes and the best possible regulatory environment, which actually isn't the case for Labour, who I think they're a pragmatic party, and I'm very sensitive as investment minister, and I don't go around saying the world will explode election day +1 if Labour win. But the fundamental direction of travel is different, and I think we have to recognise that, and we've got to celebrate what's happening today. I mean, the stock market is up for the first time in my whole working life, and I'm 50. It's reached new highs, and nothing happened until about 4 years ago. It's amazing. There's negative unemployment in the sense we've got 1 million vacancies. The life sciences sector, these new technology sectors, we're ruling the world, and a lot of that credit is thanks to the leadership of Rishi Sunak. And I hope over the next 4 to 6 weeks, people are actually going to go from just having totally platitudinous comments about political parties to actually thinking about how their personal economic well-being is going to be influenced by how they vote. And that's why I'm passionate and proud to go out there today and bang the drum. This isn't a political event, but it is relevant because it goes back to the principles of what we're trying to talk about in terms of regulation. The way the Conservatives will regulate, in my view, will be far more proclivous for growth, the freedom of citizens and the creation of a strong economy than what other parties want to do.
Matthew is sort of author's privilege, and also if I could ask our panellists...
Am I going on too long?
To deliver brilliant but slightly shorter answers.
That's it. I've finished.
There's quite a few people who want to come in, and we're going to have to finish slightly before the hour. So.
Yes, Matthew Feeney from CPS. I think my next paper might be on bats, which I wasn't expecting to come out. But a quick question on to Lord Johnson about the optimism on growth, because something I cited in the paper that came out was a comment from our conference a couple of years ago from the American economist Tyler Cowen, who said, yeah, the UK is great in a lot of industries, but it's giving away the good ideas for free. In AI and life science, it's great that we make a lot of advancements with DeepMind and AstraZeneca and the vaccine, but it's hard for...
His argument was that the London-Cambridge-Oxford triangle is of immense value to the world. It generates huge surplus for the world, but Britain captures absolutely a very small fraction of that surplus.
So I'm wondering, where's your optimism that a lot of the innovation actually result in growth for British people, and what industry gives you the most optimism?
Well, if you want a great example, the clean energy revolution, which we pioneered. The offshore windmill was invented by Margaret Thatcher, not far from this very room. And it's resulted in hundreds of billions of pounds of investment. We're the biggest recipient of investment in the whole world in the last 15 years. And we've created gigantic industries of experts who are now making a lot of money going around the world. I was in Saudi Arabia last week promoting British industry there. All these Brits are coming out from, who've been working in Teesside and Humber and up in Scotland on these big offshore wind projects. And we're selling our expertise. We're exporting our services, and they're growing at a massive rate. So I think this is phenomenal. Also, I've never worried so much about American capital. My life's been spent raising international money to come into the UK. So the idea that a British company that raises money in the States has somehow failed, I don't agree. I think it's a phenomenal thing. Let's have more of it. Yeah. We haven't lost it. These companies that are being bought, like Darktrace or Arm, they're staying here. They're getting into good quality international capital. This is to be celebrated.
And Charlotte, presumably fintech would be the area that you'd say...
Yeah, and I think tying into your previous comments, Dominic, it's what we're seeing in fintech is everyone around the world wants actually the UK to be exporting those standards. Now, sometimes we do give it away for free, so I think there is work to be done on trade deals. But the reason they want those is because they trust it. The UK does English standards and law really well. And when we look at it, and I have a regular call with many central banks on one call every week, And they sit and say, well, can the UK step up here? We want the UK to be taking the leadership because we trust the UK, even though we're a very small country in comparison to some of the markets I've been speaking to. So I think we sometimes are a little too British in our ambition there, and we do give it away because we want it to be adopted. In fintech, we have seen, and it's the second only to the US in terms of investment, which, considering the size of our consumer base, is quite incredible. But we can definitely do more. There's no doubt about it. And an incredible opportunity. I think what we have to remember in fintech is, what is it there to serve? It's there to serve consumers and SMEs. And tying back into our liability issue, and Martin and I are working on something at the moment, is we could help so many small businesses through the application of technology, of data, and that also helps to levelling up agenda, level up SMEs up and down the country. And I think there is definitely more work to be done. Liability flows are an issue there, no doubt about it, and recommendations to come soon on that, because I think that is also going to be really important. It's not just about our high-tech businesses, it's what do we do with those high-tech businesses to help others across the country as well.
The gentleman at the back, and then the...
You touched on the CLEPA review earlier, and I just thought this conversation around innovation in the UK and the private markets, it clearly is fantastic in the UK. And for fintech, as you say, being a leader only second to the US, where, when you speak to business, not just in the fintech sector, but more broadly, do they come up against frustrations when it gets to that point of potentially IPOing in the UK? Because obviously we've seen a couple of the negative stories, the dark trades taking private story, but there's a lot of good stories that are happening. What do businesses say they want to see change if they are looking to make that step and potentially IPO their business?
Very few businesses actually list in the US. So we have to remember that. And very few companies across the world get to an IPO. So actually what we want to be focusing on is growth capital. We don't have enough, no doubt about it. Crossover capital that stays patient into that, and pension fund money as well. So I would love to see us sort of focusing more on that. But these companies, dark trades, as long as dark trades gives you a good exit to some of the founders, they come and reinvest and start their companies again, that's a success story. And if I'm getting really political on it, 3 companies went to the US in the last 2 years. They reversed through SPACs. They saw the bright, shiny lights of New York, and these were real darlings of the tech sector, and all 3 of them are now bankrupt. Not just haven't delisted, they're bankrupt, because they went too early to what they thought was better. So we have to remember that actually growing your company with scale-up capital wherever it is around the world, and obviously we want UK pensioners to benefit from some of these high-growth businesses while they're in the private sector. But public markets aren't for everybody, and you've got to choose your moment wisely on those, and let's focus on creating jobs and scaling the companies before we worry about where they list.
But there is obviously something of a crisis in the public markets, or in the growing awareness. But
there is across Europe. It's not just the UK.
Well, firstly, the stock market's at an all-time high, or very close to it, and that implies there's a great deal of intrinsic value with all this activity. You've got to change some of the rules. You have to release liquidity from the capital requirements in the domestic industry, and you've got to give trustees the opportunity to invest. This is going to happen. I mean, genuinely, the next 2 years, on account of these reforms, I think are going to be phenomenal for investment in the country. It just takes time. I think the day after the Edinburgh reforms, the journalist said, why isn't it working or something? I said, well, it's going to take 2 years, 3 years. But then the momentum of that will be enormous. But we've got to change the culture. That's a crucial principle as well. Sorry, we have another question, because I know we're...
So my name's Saga, and I'm a consultant interested in the financial services sector. So another question on the financial services sector. I recognise that your paper doesn't focus on the financial services regulators, but a question to you both. One area where we're seeing constant innovation currently is in the payments systems area, particularly around open banking, also innovation around card payments as well. But it's also an area where we've seen the regulator criticised for regulatory overreach. So my question is, do you think the regulators such as the FCA, the PRA and the PSR are doing enough to stimulate competitiveness and growth in that area? And secondly, the recommendations and principles that you've set out in your report, do you think many of them are applicable to those regulators?
It's always really lovely to see the Americans get very, very excited about payment technology, which we've had for about 20 years.
I know, and let's do it in check.
It's
quite incredible.
Absolutely wonderful.
I mean, I think the PSR is in quite a challenging position on this one, because what they're actually hearing, and I have some sympathy for Chris Hemsley who runs that, is multitudes of people saying that you should do this, no, you should do this. And ultimately, they came out with a consultation which was universally pretty well rubbished in the, for people who spoke out. Privately, I don't think that was necessarily the case, but there were some very vocal people there. Open banking is a very complex area. We have incredible opportunity again for the UK to take that into open banking, to open finance, to smart data. And the pushback on the regulators, I think they've taken into consideration, and they are listening to that and doing what they should be doing, which is coming back to industry and saying, okay, if it's not that, what does that look like? But it's interesting because we're putting in principles now of commercial models, so coming back to the principles based, and and they are sitting there saying, okay, can we hear your principles of this, of how it should work? So sometimes they may not necessarily get it right by the looks of it, but as long as they're listening to what happens next, then that's the most important thing.
And Dominic, can I expand that second aspect of the question? I mean, one of the things which came out of our review was essentially that the Treasury likes to set the rules for the rest of Whitehall and not really follow them. Like it exempted itself from all of the I think one of the issues we could have discussed was regulatory budgeting and one in, one out, which you haven't done. But even when we did have it, the Treasury said, yeah, thanks, that's for everyone else, not for us. And obviously the Treasury maintains control of the finance. So, I mean, should the financial services regulators be reading your white paper?
Yes.
And B, should the Treasury be reading your...
Everyone should read it, and it's very important. So these principles should be applied, and this is the view of the government, to everyone who's involved in any form of regulatory activity. So it's not just because you're in the FCA, I shouldn't read it. If you read the 10 principles, they're obvious. I mean, they're pretty common sense approaches, and it's a helpful guide. I think I just want to end on a point because I know we're coming to a conclusion. But I heard a great story the other day, which just struck me as how we want to look at things. We want to reverse the telescope. And in lockdown in Canada, everyone started. You took two choices. You either grew a moustache and learned to cook, which is what I did, or you took lots of exercise.
Can we please have some photos?
Which is what? No, they have been redacted under the Freedom of Information Act 30-year rule. Or you took exercise, and a lot of people went off, jogging and learning to ride a bicycle, probably continuing to ride their bicycle they learned to ride when they were a child. And there were parks in Canada where you had a lot of congestion, so you had bicyclists crashing into runners and hikers. And so the first thing the parks did was what we would probably do, which was they fined any bicycle that didn't have a bell, $50 or whatever. And what happened was everyone got very cross. Huge numbers of fines were issued, nothing changed. So then they issued the park wardens with screwdrivers and bells. And if they saw a bike without a bell, they said, you've got two choices. We can put a bell on for you, or you can pay a $50 fine. Now, surprise, surprise, within, I think, a week, accidents were reduced to zero, there were no fines being levied, and everyone was happy. Because the regulator became an enabler. It looked at what they actually wanted to achieve, rather than how they could fine, punish, and block. That's the difference. That's what we need to do. We need to rejoice in that, because the outcomes are what we should be far more focused on, and the principles, rather than the rules themselves and the codes. Let's liberate our minds and businesses to achieve what we need them to achieve, and actually give great services and cheap products with a wide range of opportunities to our consumers.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question, I'm afraid, so if anyone wants to ask the last one, or we can just wrap up now. Anyone?
Any other great thoughts? Has anyone read my paper? You can read it after the event. There are some copies. There are free copies.
There are free copies of Dominic's paper. There are free copies of our paper.
We're giving them away.
Both of them are well worth reading, especially if you are a Labour candidate.
Yes, but thanks to CPS. If I could just put a plug in for the CPS. I think it's such an important organisation, and it's very, very well led by you, by the way. I'm very proud that you've asked me to come and talk about this, because these philosophical points are what's going to define our nation. And I think that we've seen a very, very large bureaucracy grow over the last 20 years, which is costing us far more than we think. And I think we accept it with nods and shrugs. And really, we must not do this if we're to survive and prosper as a nation. And the next government, I think's primary challenge, actually, are not the components that we talk about. It's dealing with that point and trying to change our principles so that we can release the energy of our nation.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for saying that in front of a CPS board member.
By the way, thank you, Charlotte.
Very well governed as
To
well.
be next door to you is a privilege as well.
So thank you very much for joining us, and we will be running a series of events during the election.
Yes.
We haven't quite decided what they are yet.
Good.
Because like everyone else, we were kind of taken by surprise. But I hope to see a lot of you over the next few weeks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.